Hello and welcome to another watercolor tutorial with me, Candace from Hey Sweet Art. And today we are going to be painting in the negative. We are going to be doing a tutorial on negative painting. So just to start with a blank sheet of paper, I would like you to paint in a very light wash, which is slightly more diluted pigment. We're going to paint in 2 squares. And underneath that, we're going to be painting 2 leaves. So this first portion is just going to be a quick demonstration to go through different examples of negative and positive painting. Once I've painted in my leaves, I'm also going to paint a flat wash in a big sort of rectangle next to these elements, and this is where we will start applying that into a quick demonstration of negative painting in layers and building up to create a sort of forest. So looking in from the foreground into the background, obviously what's in the foreground is lighter, what's in the background is darker, and as you know, when you work in watercolor, you are working from your lightest layers and building out to your darkest layers. If you want to add a little bit of textural interest, you can play around while this layer is wet, bringing in some other colors and maybe smaller sections with slightly intenser versions of your colors, just to create some texture and some interest. But the beauty of painting into wet is that obviously that will gently diffuse and bloom into that wet surface beneath it. We're going to hop back over to our squares and leaves on the left hand side, and I'm going to paint in first a positive circle into this first square. So as you can see, I am painting in the actual subject, that being the circle in the middle of my square. The subject is also going to be the circle in the middle of my square for the negative painting, but in this instance we wanted to remain in the foreground, and so we paint everything around it, thereby pushing that circle forward. In the leaf example, the positive and negative painting is referring to the veins of the leaf. So in the first leaf, I am painting in the veins, which is in the positive. So I'm actually painting over the leaf beneath with the vein details. When you paint in the negative though, you actually paint in the shapes that surround the veins of the leaf. So you can see I'm going to work in sections, and I'm just painting in section at a time, leaving my vein intact. I've not drawn in any outlines to sort of mark the areas that are going to feature the trees. All I am doing is sort of gesturing where these trees are going to go. So I've made a light wash color that is slightly darker than my base color, and I am painting in the negative shapes so that the trees appear in the foreground. This is layer 1, which you'll see in the bigger example exercise that we do after this, is our lightest layer showing through, and we paint everything except our number 1 layer, which is in this instance is going to be our forest foreground. So I'm painting in all the negative shapes, and I'm just painting from my mind, so you can try to follow along with what I'm doing, but feel free for your tree shapes to take on any shape or form that you feel. So can you see, as I'm working through this first layer, the negative painting is my background, and that is helping to push the first tree shape forward into the foreground. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to paint another tree on the right hand side, and then I'm going to let this layer dry completely. You need things to dry, so there is the added element of having lots of patience. So in between layers, go make a cup of tea, catch up on emails if you need to, or whatever you might do while you wait for layers to dry. And then we will slowly start building to the background of our forest. So while we wait for this first layer of paint to dry, we're just going to mix a slightly darker version of our color, whatever we are working in. I'm adding more pigment to my mixture. I might need to add a little bit more water just so that I have enough to cover my page. But you definitely want to have some sort of color shift or value shift. So you're either going to tweak the color a little bit, or you're going to increase the contrast of the color that you're working in if you're working in one color. When you are happy that this layer of paint has dried, we'll start working on our next layer of trees. And in the next layer, we're going to basically be doing the same as we did in the first. So we'll be plotting in layer number 2's trees, but at the same time, we also are avoiding layer 1. So we're going to plot in the shape of our layer 2 trees, still painting in the negative. So you're painting in the background spaces behind the trees, not the physical trees. And we are being sure not to paint in layer 1 trees either. Again, I'm not really following a specific reference for this. These tree shapes are just coming from my mind, and I know that I haven't templated this or traced it out, but I also want you to just be able to be creative and fill your page with whatever tree shapes come to mind. We're only on our technically second layer of trees, and already you are starting to see that depth showing through. So we can definitely distinguish between our foreground trees and the trees that are in the background. While that's drying, we are just going to mix another darker mixture of our previous layer. So whether that's a color shift or a value shift, you just want to mix your batch of paint so that it's ready and that it is a slightly more intense version of the color that you're working in. So my layer is dry, and I'm now going to start working in my third layer of trees. So this time we are going to avoid our layer 1 and layer 2 trees, and we are going to plot in our layer 3 trees by painting in the negative. So again, we are painting in the surrounding space around our tree shapes. So depending on what you feel like, you can go ahead and paint another layer of trees in for just additional practice. I'm going to stop after this layer and I'm going to move on to the next exercise, where we will be painting the ginkgo leaf or Ginkgo leaf, depending on how you pronounce that. In the link below, you will find a downloadable template that you can use for this exercise. And to start off, I'm just going to quickly run through what you need. You'll need your watercolor paper, a ballpoint pen and a pencil. This is to do the transfer. Obviously the downloadable PDF with the template, and this is just a grayscale showing you the sort of depths which you'll also get in that attachment. So you're going to move your watercolor paper out of the way, and using the side of your pencil, you're just going to lay down some graphite onto the back of the page. I'm being careful to make sure that I'm going over the lines that I can see underneath, and we're just going to cover as much as we need for doing the transfer. You don't need to try and make sure you are covering the whole page. Just see if you can identify those lines, lay in the graphite that you can, and we also will not be tracing the numbers. We are only going to be outlining the actual lines. Those numbers are there for you to reference while we are busy doing the painting, in terms of what layers we'll be working on and when you leave certain layers out. In the next step, you are going to position that template on your watercolor paper. I'm just going to tape it in place with some washi tape. And using the ballpoint pen, I am going to trace over those lines, not to worry about any of writing the numbers as I explained. We are just focusing on those outlines of the leaves. If you're not doing this in real time with me, feel free to fast forward a little bit. Okay, I'm happy with that transfer, and the next thing we are going to do is mix our paint. So yeah, you can mix a selection of colors. Ultimately, you want to make sure that the colors you use are all a light wash. So you can choose whether to paint in a single color or to paint in a variety of colors, but we want to keep those colors light. So I'm going in with a light mixture of yellow, some green. I'll maybe add in a little bit of red, so there's a sort of feeling of an autumn coming through in my initial layer. So as I previously mentioned, with any negative painting exercise, there are going to be phases of drying between that you just need to be patient, let things dry, go make yourself some tea. When you come back with your washi tape, just tear a few of these tiny pieces, and using your guide, the guide that you outlined from, cover up your number ones, and this will help be a visual guide for when you're painting in your next layer to avoid those leaves in what you're painting. So we're going to paint the negative space around those leaves. So just with this washi tape, it's just a handy little tip. You don't have to do it. If you can gauge where your number one leaves are meant to be, then by all means don't worry about the washi tape, just go ahead and paint. But the washi tape will really help just for you to identify those shapes and make sure not to paint over them. It is an exercise that requires some concentration, so it's just a nice little aid to make it go a bit quicker. Again, we are also working in our wash layer, and we do want to try work as quickly as we can. Obviously, in a wash layer consistency, we have a nice smooth wash, and we want to try and make sure that as we are painting, areas are not drying ahead of paint that's still going to come and connect with that, and then we get blooming. So I'm working as quickly as I can. I'll work in these, especially in this layer when there's a little bit more ground to cover, so I'll work in sections where I go paint a section, but then I'll quickly catch up with the previous section like I am now, just making sure that I continue spreading that paint while that surface is still damp and wet, because if you were painting slowly, obviously that would start drying before you are able to reach back to it and further pull paint along the same journey. So just to avoid those sort of very defined lines where you have stopped painting to go and paint elsewhere, this is just a handy little piece of advice for you to try work in sections, but then work quickly within those so you can go back and continue along a journey in one area and then come back and continue along the journey in that other area, but it's the same color, so we should be able to identify like when we need to reconnect. As you can see here, I'm accidentally painting around a leaf that should be a number 2. For some reason my brain just isolated it, but I do come back and I just paint over it, so don't let that confuse you. I'm gonna incorporate it into my layer 2. I'll come back and paint a wash layer over it. Again, you're going to wait for that page to dry before you come in with your next step. Once it's dry, you'll pop in your pieces of washi tape just to help distinguish which leaves to avoid in your next layer. I've already mixed up my next darker batch of paint, and I'm going to start painting in everything in the background and leaving my layers 1 and 2 leaves without paint, so only painting in the background layers. In this next section, I'm going to show you how to troubleshoot a mistake. So if you have accidentally painted over a stalk of a leaf, how you can lift it, as well as if you have maybe painted into a section that you shouldn't have. So I will go through the process of troubleshooting this just to help when you are painting and you've possibly made a mistake. So as I work in this section, I've started painting over a stalk for leaf number 2. I'm just going to continue finishing off that section because once you've started, you don't want to stop in the middle. So rather just cover that stalk to completion. And here I'm moving into a number 2 leaf where I should not be painting. So I've realized my mistake and I'm just quickly going to finish off the section of negative painting that should be there. I'm rinsing off my brush, wiping it off on a paper towel so it's not overly saturated. I'm just coming to wet off that section where it's in the leaf, and then using a paper towel, I'm going to lift that liquid into the paper towel just to lift it off the surface of my page. So there's a little bit of redemption. And now to address the stalk, what I've done is rinsed off my brush, wiped it off on a paper towel so that it is very, very lightly damp, so hardly any water in there. I've dragged the brush across that stalk just to lift off the pigment into my brush. So again, hit pause and let that layer dry. When you come back, I'd like you to take your pencil and just go over your outlines a little bit so that you can better see them for the next couple layers. Because as we've built up our layers, those lines slowly start fading beneath in the negative painting layers. So it's just to sort of give them a bit of a refresh so you can see where they are for your layers 4 and 5. So in the next layer, once we've done this outline, we are going to cover our number 3s as well, which means we will only be painting sections 4 and 5. And then once that's done, we have one layer left where we are only painting in layers 5. So not much further to go, and you'll also feel like these layers start going quicker because it's less of a large area to paint. These smaller layers go a little bit quicker, and very soon you'll have a beautifully layered leaf painting. I've touched out my outline, so I'm just going to pop little pieces of washi tape onto my number 3s so that I know I'm only going to be painting layer 4 and 5, not number 1, 2 and 3. With a slightly darker mixture of paint, I'm now going to paint in my layers 4 and 5, or my sections 4 and 5 rather, and I'm leaving the leaves in numbers 1, 2 and 3 intact. So I'm not going to paint anything in numbers 1, 2 and 3. Now you can really see that layered effect taking place. Once this layer is dry, we'll move on to our very last layer, which is only painting in your number 5s. And this I don't mark off. I simply mix up a darker batch of paint and I go according to my reference. So I keep looking at my guide that is on the right hand side of the image, and I'm checking for where I have indicated those number 5s, and that is all I am going to paint, just the number 5s. Once this section is complete, you can start to peel off your washi tape, let things dry, and then you will have a beautiful example of a negative painting. Thank you so much for painting with me. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you are not already, please will you subscribe to this YouTube channel. It really goes a long way to supporting further content creation for Hey Sweetheart and bringing out new watercolor content. The option to join my Patreon is also out there if you would like to receive regular tutorial content each month that is unique to my Patreon offering. So once again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.